Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Views of an Outsider, Parenting Our Children, Parenting Ourselves, Part 5. More of Teaching Adolescents Responsibility. This week we return once more to our current series, which is based on the idea of taking the principles that would allow someone to parent a child well, and then trying to use those same principles to successfully reparent ourselves, regardless of whether you were someone who was lucky enough to have great parents, or someone who unfortunately had parents who were not so great. One thing is for certain, no one had parents who were perfect. So to varying degrees, we all require a bit of a do-over in order to help us let go of any unhelpful baggage that is weighing us down and holding us back. That way we can be free to rise as high as we possibly can as we attempt to build lives for ourselves that are full of the best experiences that we can possibly manage to soak up during our brief time here. There are a lot of people in the world these days who are selling one version or another of self-help, but hardly any of them agree in the advice that they offer to the world. So how is a person supposed to figure out whose advice to act on? Out of all of the experts that are available to choose from, I personally think that Jordan Peterson is the one that it makes the most sense to listen to. As a world-renowned psychologist, he is highly trained and qualified. He has also actually walked the walk and successfully raised 2 kids of his own, who have not only thrived in their own lives, but they still continue to have voluntary, healthy relationships with their parents now that they are adults, which is basically the entire end goal of parenting, and a goal that every parent hopes to achieve for themselves, even though with 1 out of every 4 young people going completely no contact with their parents, it seems like fewer and fewer people are actually succeeding on that front these days. But to top all of that off, Jordan's advice has a proven track record. It has worked for thousands of people who have tried it, including his children, who are now successfully raising his 6 grandchildren, while also running thriving business ventures of their own. With a resume that boasts all of those selling points, you really couldn't ask for much more when trying to decide who to trust. And that is where Jordan's new parenting series comes in. I found it fascinating and extremely practical, which is kind of Jordan's forte. And even though the advice that he offers in his new series is tailored specifically for parents and soon-to-be parents, perhaps there are also some insights that we can find within these lessons that will help the rest of us when it comes to discovering the best way to set about reparenting ourselves. In the first week of this series, we took a look at the roles that parents play in their children's lives. We considered what the spirit of the mother brings to her child's world and what the spirit of the father brings as well. We also looked at the perspectives that they should each try to incorporate into their roles, and we considered some of the pitfalls that each parent can avoid if they are both properly prepared ahead of time to watch out for them. Then we took all of that information and applied it to the idea of raising ourselves to be the people that we each aspire to be. Then for 2 weeks, we zoomed in on toddlerhood. We looked at this magical time of life and at the common misbehaviors that come along for the ride. We took in both the positive things and the negative things about this brief window in a child's life, and we discussed the best ways to maximize all of the potentials of this goldmine phase in human development in order to successfully set the child up for a productive and happy life. Then once again, we took all of that information and applied it to the idea of helping ourselves mature into the kind of people that we most admire. Last week, we jumped forward in the journey of childhood to another turbulent phase in the development of young people as we focused in on adolescence. Lesson 1 was that spoiled children do not develop independence. We discussed exactly why that is such a devastating fate. And straight out of the gate, we decided to recognize the simple reality that the key to unlocking an enriching life for a young adult to flourish in is to successfully teach them responsibility. Because there comes a time in every child's life when they realize that they're standing on the precipice of adulthood, and naturally, that transition is both exciting, confusing, and scary all at the same time. And each of those emotions are bound to generate a lot of questions. So it is hardly surprising that adolescence is a time when newly fledged teens begin to brim with thoughts about things like identity, autonomy, and meaning. And it is during this important window of time that learning responsibility becomes crucial, both as a way of answering the big questions of life and in order to lay the foundations for a future in which young adults will actually thrive. Today we are taking on Lesson 2, which is, it's important to establish a pattern of negotiation. As your children get older, you will have to begin negotiating with them more instead of simply telling them what to do. Otherwise, they'll just rebel, and often they'll do it behind your backs. So you have to get the practice of negotiating up and running, out in the open, as early as possible. When there's an issue that needs to be dealt with, you need to specifically identify the problem, make sure that everyone agrees on what the problem is, and then jointly construct a hypothetical solution. At that point, you can negotiate about the strategies and the strategies for enforcing the agreement that you've entered into together. And that is the same process that you would use with yourself when it comes to your own goals. You start by examining the issue that you've decided to work on. And when you are confident that you have pinpointed the problem, you can negotiate with yourself until you have come up with a detailed, reasonable strategy that you can start implementing. And that strategy should include specific and reasonable enforcement mechanisms that you've thoughtfully designed in order to keep yourself on the path that you've decided you want to pursue. You should start negotiating with your child in simple ways from the time that they are 2 years old. Depending on the skill of the child, you can start practicing simple negotiations as soon as the child can talk. For example, can you eat some broccoli? Can you take 2 bites? As your child matures, you have to scaffold that concept up, expanding its complexity in order to match the child's reasoning abilities at the time. A practical place to start is to decide how the game of your household is going to be played concerning the chores that need to get done. These tasks would include washing the dishes, taking out the trash, doing the laundry, cleaning the bathrooms, and so on. For any given situation, you can lay out for your kids what the tasks are. It might be cleaning up a given room or preparing for meal times. You can say, here are the 6 things that need to be done in order for us to eat, or to be able to have fun spending time together. So we can either fight about what has to be done anyway, and everyone will end up miserable and unhappy, and then we'll still have to do it. Or we can do this properly because it has to be done, and if we do it properly, then you'll also learn how to do it for yourself, and you'll be a capable, contributing human being. And that way our meal times can be enjoyable and entertaining, and we can communicate well with one another and accomplish everything that we need to as an effective team. So it would be really helpful if you decided that you were going to take responsibility for one or more of those tasks. Which ones would you be willing to do? Because it's necessary to shoulder your share of the load in the family economy. Likewise, you can look at the things that you need to accomplish in your own life and the reasons that you actually need to get them done. You can point out the benefits to yourself along with the consequences to yourself for not stepping up, including feeling bad about yourself. And then break those goals down into individual tasks and ask yourself which task you could handle starting with so that you can take a new step towards a more productive life that you can feel good about. When you're trying to make changes in your family, especially if you're seeking counseling or outside advice, it's helpful to let your kids know that it's not because they're a bad kid. It's because you've made some mistakes and you want to learn how to correct those mistakes so that things can be better for everyone, including them. And they'll probably be okay with that. Frame the situation as a collaboration problem and a communication problem, because pointing fingers isn't going to be useful to you, especially given that as a family, you have to live with each other. Besides, the probability that it is all the other person's fault, or all your fault, is pretty low. The bottom line is that you've hit an impasse in being able to communicate effectively with each other, and who knows what all of the reasons for that are. But in the spirit of collaboration and communication, it might be helpful to find out from your teenager what they think is causing these unpleasant events to happen in your home. Throwing the responsibility for some of the input back on them is often a helpful thing to do. That, too, is a step towards assuming more adult responsibility. It is also helpful to talk things through with yourself when it comes to the problems that you are struggling with. If you've never treated yourself like an actual adult and given yourself the space to do what it requires to really work through what you think about your life, then it can be easy to dismiss the idea that you might have some helpful insights about yourself to offer. But you might end up being surprised. When it comes to teenagers, setting clear goals with them is a helpful place to start. For example, you could say, the next time we have a dispute, let's see if we can bring it to a resolution within 15 minutes. And when that situation inevitably arises, don't frame your response as they have to learn to control themselves, because that's not a helpful attitude, and it's probably not going to elicit a very helpful response from them. Think of the situation more along the lines of, we're going to work together so that we can resolve this in the next 15 minutes. What do you think is the best way that we could go about doing that? Do you need to go to your room in order to have the space that you need in order to calm down? Do you want to come back out after 15 minutes? And they might say, oh no. But you're still going to have to negotiate through that frustrating situation. And you especially don't want to be angry after it's finally over, because at that point, you've gotten progress. And you don't want to punish that with anger. You want to be able to say, really good work getting yourself under control. Let's get on with the day. That's the attitude that parents need to have after a conflict has been resolved. Good work. I'm proud of you. Keep it up. It can also be a big help to find out what your teenager wants from you. If they're going to go through the work of learning to regulate their emotions, which they need to learn how to do anyway for their own sake, then you need to know directly from them everything that you can do to help them succeed in that goal. You need to try to see this as a joint project that you've undertaken together, especially given that as a teenager, your child is entering into more of an adult relationship with you anyway. And that is a good thing. You want to develop a functional adult relationship with your child. This is not easy to do because most people are terrible at negotiating. And unfortunately, being terrible at negotiating is one of the best ways to ensure that you will end up failing in your life. To negotiate something effectively, you have to decide what the goal is. And you can negotiate with each other in order to decide what the mutual goal is. And once you've done that, then you can negotiate the strategies that will get you to your goal. Giving your child the advantage in their life of being able to do this well is such a powerful gift. You're teaching your child how to envision a goal for themselves that they want to pursue, how to lay out a strategy for getting what they want out of life, and how to successfully discuss that plan with the other people who may be involved in that process. That is an unbelievably useful thing for a person to learn how to be able to do. If you get really good at negotiating, then you can make deals with the people around you non-stop in a playful and productive manner. In that scenario, everything that you do is going to have a much higher probability of turning out positively. The truth is that life is negotiation. And that is precisely why it is such a great thing to teach this skill early, because your child is going to have to do it, badly or well, for the rest of their life. They'll have to negotiate, badly or well, with their roommates and their co-workers, with each new partner that they have, and eventually with their spouse, and then with their own children one day. How well or how poorly they are able to do this is going to determine a big part of how happy or unhappy they are going to be in their life. It's more important just to practice the skill of negotiation than it is to get your child to do the things that they've agreed to do, even though it's also very, very important to encourage them to do the things that they've agreed to do. It's important to get them to stick to their word and to reward them when they conduct themselves like a fully self-possessed human being. And it's just as important for each of us to practice expanding our own ability to negotiate well at each opportunity that we are given. And we'll have lots of chances to improve in that area, because negotiations arise everywhere in life. Our life is one long series of negotiations. It is also important to stick to your own word, including when you give your word to yourself. We don't especially like the people who always let us down and who can't be relied on to do what they say they will. We feel betrayed and wronged by those people, and you aren't going to feel any differently about that person just because it's you who can't be trusted or depended on to be there for yourself. And disliking yourself isn't a recipe for a good life. It is reasonable and realistic to aim for having a household with minimal altercations in it. So be practical about it and set aside some time for explicit negotiations around contentious issues like chores. Have weekly family meetings that function under a clear set of rules for how those negotiations are going to happen and how you're going to handle moments of upset during those negotiations. Knowing how to negotiate effectively is a very useful life skill, and one that many people today completely lack. Most people are very bad at being able to directly tell someone else what they actually want from them. They are also very ineffective when it comes to being able to get other people to be forthcoming about what they need from them. On top of all of that, most people are very bad when it comes to strategizing. That step is one that constantly gets skipped, and that is one of the reasons why it is so hard to succeed at gaining the things that we want. But with those valuable skills at their disposal, your kids will have no limits to the kind of lives that they can build for themselves. So give your teenager the opportunity to start practicing this skill set by seeing if you can get them to develop a goal of some kind, without shaping it yourself any more than you absolutely have to. One example of that would be to say, if things were better in the home, what would that look like to you? You want them to engage. So everything that they'll offer to contribute to the discussion is a step forward. You want them to generate ideas and visions for the future on their own. And then they can learn to clarify them and refine them. And the probability that your desires will coincide with one another is pretty high. But your teenager also might have a take on the situation that's slightly different from your own, and maybe they'll shine a light on something that you didn't even know was going on under the surface. But either way, the more that they can come up with the vision of what could be better, the more they will be invested in making their vision a reality. Then you want to see if you can find a way to bring their vision and your vision together so that you're both even more pleased with the collaborative vision than you were with your own. At that point, you're on board together, and everyone has bought into pursuing this path. You always want buy-in from the person that you're collaborating with or negotiating with, because that greatly increases your odds of succeeding. You want to be fully bought into the visions that you have for your own life too, or you're not going to realize them and achieve the things that you want to in life. So if you aren't on board and committed to the goals that you've set for yourself, then you might need to tinker with your vision until you are fully bought in. How do you know when you've achieved buy-in from your teenager? Think about what you do with them that you are certain works. Can you successfully help them with their music practice or their sports practice, for example, so that they are still smiling at the end of the session? Are they into doing that activity with you, even if you're the one who suggests it? Or is there resistance? If they're into it, you know that you have buy-in. And if you have buy-in, it works and you get a good outcome. So if you're offering to engage with your teenager and you're met with resistance, you might need to assess whether or not you were sufficiently sophisticated in getting buy-in from them, because there are probably other situations where you were sophisticated enough to elicit that kind of a response from them, and you know that those situations worked. There's no blame in that. It's just a problem that needs to be analyzed so that it can be optimized. Apparently, the two of you didn't establish an agreement about how you were going to spend your time that was sufficiently mutual in its benefits, goal, and approach. You will know that you have buy-in in a negotiation when you lay out a vision for a shared activity that everyone is enthusiastic about, or that they at least cannot think of a better alternative to. Sometimes being enthusiastically thrilled is too much to ask under the circumstances, but you can at least negotiate until the point where no one can come up with a better idea. Buy-in means that everybody is voluntarily on board. The same is true for yourself. You don't have to be brimming with enthusiasm about every step of the journey that you've chosen, although that helps, but it's also an awful lot to ask for. To be on board, you have to at least not have a better idea, including doing what you've been doing. Think about buy-in in the context of play between children. When a group of children get together, the first thing that they have to do is come up with a game to play together. And then they all have to be willing to engage in playing that particular game. At that point, they can actually play together, and it'll be fun and productive, and maybe they will even make some new friends. That's a great way to conceptualize a negotiation and the idea of getting buy-in. If you negotiate successfully and you get buy-in, then the venture that has been negotiated can be playful when it happens. Think of a family trip, for example. If everyone's on board with where you're going and why, and how everyone is going to conduct themselves while you're gone, then it's a playful adventure that you can all enjoy being on. For example, you can negotiate if the long car ride is worth it in order to be able to go to this particular place for this desired experience together. And if the answer is yes, by having negotiated it, you'll have the buy-in that you need in order to make that long car ride much more enjoyable instead of a nightmare. This approach can work all through your child's teenage years and beyond, especially if you establish this pattern of engaging in negotiations together. If all three of you are committed to that approach, then you'll probably make pretty rapid progress with some periodic backsliding. But the pattern of progress usually happens along these lines. You get progress, and then there'll be a period where things fall apart. And then you'll need to renegotiate. and you'll go back to where you were and beyond. And then you'll backslide again. That's how these things work with your teenager and with yourself. So if your teenager backslides and you have a bad week, negotiate that. Be upfront with him. Tell him there's going to be some bumps along the road, but just because we hit a rough patch, that doesn't mean that we've failed. You don't want him to get discouraged and think, here we go again, it's the same old thing as before, nothing has changed. This is never going to work. And you don't want to succumb to those thoughts either. That rabbit hole is just not productive to fall into. And you can't avoid it if you have realistic expectations going in. Maturity is the sacrifice of the present for the future and for others. Immaturity is sacrificing the future or the community for the immediate and the temporary. We live in a world that encourages immaturity, not maturity. It can be helpful just to realize that. As Jonathan Haidt points out, algorithms train us to trap ourselves in our own immaturity because they optimize for the immediate and the fleeting. The simple truth is that we have all become dopamine addicts. But there is more than one kind of a dopamine rush. The dopamine rush that we get from succeeding in the pursuit of a long-term goal is a slow drip, like a time-release capsule, instead of a roller coaster spike followed by a crash. People aren't getting to experience this kind of dopamine. But the ability to set goals is part of maturing. I want to achieve X, and therefore I have to accomplish steps A, B, C, and D. But if we all get stuck at A all of the time because it's so effective at hooking us, then we will never get to B, C, or D, and we will never get anywhere near X. Without that ability, we don't develop into a competent adult, an adult that someone else would want to hire or marry. Another cause of chronic immaturity is that we aren't practicing overcoming our lesser fears and learning resilience when we're young. In real life, you are going to lose more games than you will win. We all end up losing half of the time at least. And the advantage to that is that you develop resilience in the face of loss. You have to accept it gracefully, you have to learn from it, and you have to persist in order to win down the line. Loss is important. We need those experiences over and over when we're growing up. And we need all of the things that we learn from those experiences. That is how mammals learn, through repetitive, low-stakes play when we are young. You don't have to win that many games in order to be successful. You only have to win some of them, but you definitely have to be able to persevere through loss in order to be successful. The games that children play together teach them the constraint of rules, how to work together, and how to navigate disputes so that they can keep the game going. Yes, there are disagreements, but there is also pressure to work them out so that the game will continue. And that pressure is enforced through the understanding that if you storm off and refuse to negotiate until you work the issue out, then you're a crybaby. Play teaches kids negotiation. Video games, unfortunately, don't. Because the game decides everything that's important for you. You either leveled up or you didn't. You died or you won. The nutrition for growth and maturing is in the disagreements. So even though there's nothing wrong with video games, they are the junk food of play. In a real game, first you learn to follow the rules. Then you develop the ability to explain the rules accurately to someone else. Then you develop the ability to successfully negotiate the rules. Then you develop the ability to come up with new rules. But you have to crawl before you can walk, and you have to walk before you can run. If you try to skip from 0 to making up your own rules, then you're actually just staying at 0 because you never learned how to work within rules. When there is a stage of transition in a child's development, the new stage is capable of everything that the previous stage could do, plus something additional. Maturing is about stacking building blocks. Once you can follow the rules, you can play the game. Once you can describe the rules, you can play the game with someone else and discuss it productively. Once you can negotiate the rules, you can do all of those things, plus succeed in the negotiation. And finally, you can establish your own games. Clear progression through the expansion of skill is what maturing looks like. This modern idea that games that have a clear victor are somehow bad for kids is dead wrong. Because the cooperative element to these games absorbs the competitive element. The main principle is that everyone wants the game to continue to its conclusion. That is prioritized even above winning. Your goal for your teenager and for yourself is to provide the opportunities for both of you to practice these skills and get better and better at them. To sum up, what are the lessons that you might take away from this second lesson? Establish a pattern of negotiation. Once you have teenagers, they're old enough to think for themselves and to start fleshing out what it means to be a person who's bearing their fair share of the world as they move forward in their expanding life. Lesson 3 is, you should distribute responsibility where you can. By the time that your kids are teenagers, you should be having weekly meetings with them as a family to lay out the challenges of the upcoming week, including all of the jobs that have to be done. You want to have your kids participate in those negotiations about who's going to do what. The rules are fairly straightforward for a negotiation like that. These are the jobs that have to be done. Everybody has to accept their fair share of responsibility. The discussion continues until everyone has voluntarily done that as happily as they can manage. If anyone gets upset during the discussion, they can leave momentarily to get their act together. But then they have to come back until everything is sorted out. The negotiation is designed to establish the rules of the game so that the game will hopefully be pleasant and result in a positive effort being expended in doing what is necessary in order to make the household run in a harmonious way. You can also ask your teenagers to specify their own rewards for complying with these goals, and you can get them to specify their own consequences if they fail too. And of course, there are standing agreements that need to be negotiated, like each person is responsible for being considerate of other people in the house by, for example, putting things back where they're supposed to be and where others expect to find them. When it comes to chores, kids will often say, "Why do I have to do that?" Or, "That doesn't seem fair." And a good response to that is, can you think of a reason why you would have to do that? What would happen if no one did it? What is it going to be like for you if you never do it? What is it going to be like for you if you whine and complain every time that you have a job to get done? How are you going to end up succeeding in your life if that's the approach that you take to the responsibilities that are going to exist in your life when they come up? Negotiations are something that you want to get solidly established within your family so that everybody not only bears the responsibility that's necessary, but so that they can also regard themselves as contributing members of the household in a genuine way and have what people so casually refer to as appropriate self-esteem. You have genuine, meaningful self-esteem when you are actually carrying the responsibility for your life to the degree that you are capable of. That's why it's good to distribute responsibility where you can, and not to do more for people than you have to do. It helps in these negotiations when you talk to your teenager like they are a responsible person. You can be honest with them and say, "We've got a few years to prepare you to live as an adult out in the world." One of the things you could do is list the responsibilities in the house that need to be divided up and say, these are the things that have to be done in the house that it would also be useful for you to learn how to do, because at some point you're going to be doing them for yourself. And you don't want to be living in a hellhole when you go off to college, which can easily happen to people if they don't know anything about how to cook, or how to clean, or how to maintain a house. So ask your teenager, how much of this list do you think is your fair share? Or even better, ask them, how much of this work do you think you'd have to do in order to feel really good about what you're contributing to the household? Teenagers are old enough to start thinking about that. And it's important that they do, because they may never have noticed that they feel better about themselves when they pull their own weight. Plus, they become more mature by doing so. But they might not have put those two things together, because lots of people don't put those things together. They've never told themselves, I could actually do something useful. Unfortunately, the school system doesn't help when it comes to teaching kids that connection between responsibility and a sense of capable worth as a person. Instead, they do a lot of false self-esteem training. They tell young people that you should feel good about yourself no matter who you are or what you do. But that is BS. Being made in the image of God gives everyone a base level of intrinsic worth. That's true. But a lot of how you should feel about yourself is conditional. If you are being a useless leech causing trouble for everyone around you, then you aren't doing anything to feel good about. So all of the false esteem training out there in the world isn't going to accomplish anything real inside of you. But if you are pulling your weight and doing what you should be doing, then you should have some reasonable respect for yourself. And earned respect is a way more stable foundation for self-esteem to rest on than thin air, which means that it can actually be relied on when you need it. Empty platitudes can't. If your teenager is 13 and they are pulling their weight, then they have also earned more of a right to have an opinion. And that's a powerful thing to learn when you're 13, and it will continue to serve you well throughout your life. But if your child is not attending to their responsibilities, then you need to sit down and talk to your spouse. Together, you need to determine exactly what are the responsibilities that they are not undertaking that they need to start shouldering. If your teenager made an agreement with you that they didn't live up to, you need to talk to them and say, we had a deal, and we noticed that you're not holding up your end of that deal, and here's the evidence for that. We both feel this way. So there are three possibilities. One, we didn't make a very good deal. Two, you're being lazy and useless. Or three, the task was too complex for you. Which do you think it is? Now, if they say, I didn't think the deal was fair, then an appropriate answer would be, Well, I guess you should have negotiated more effectively for yourself when we had our meeting. But let's go over it again and see if we can reestablish the ground rules for an agreement. Under what circumstances would you be willing to do this task? See if there's a way that you could change the reward structure to make it more effective. You could also discuss with your spouse what privileges might be revoked if necessary, but also evaluate if maybe the task was too much for them, and if so, then you can break it down into smaller portions and see if you can get them to do part of it, and then reward them for that. That is something that you can at least keep building on. Getting nowhere isn't. If your teenager has a hard time sticking to what they've agreed to, that's grounds for another negotiation. You can say, if we make a deal and you don't hold up your end, what should we do? I can't just let you get away with it because that's no good. But I don't want to use a strategy that's counterproductive. That's a better approach than getting frustrated. If you made a deal with him to clean up his room every day, and he doesn't do it, one of the ways of dealing with that is to break up the task, renegotiate, and get them to clean up half of their room every day. And if that doesn't work, then get them to clean up a quarter of their room. You can lower the size of the demand until you get somewhere, and then you can start to build on that by raising the bar as your team gets better at shouldering responsibility. But you have to find a successful starting point in order to even start building anything. What you want to do is put the kid in a position where he can succeed with a bit of effort. You want to set up the negotiation so that it's weighted toward them succeeding. That's a good way of negotiating in general, stacking the deck in favor of success. What if your teenager won't engage and just repeats, oh no, to everything that you say, even when you try to guide them along with breadcrumbs? How do you get them to reach a place of mature reasoning where they can start figuring things out for themselves? You can start by honestly telling them, the problem with I don't know is that if you don't know, then I have to. And if I have to know for you, all by myself, then what I know is going to be imposed on you. You can't afford to check out and not engage in your own life either, because there is a rule in this world. All abdicated responsibility will be taken away from you and used by the tyrants around you against you. It's a terrible rule, but it's true. That's a hard thing to learn, but it will save you from harsher lessons. The I don't know problem is very complicated because people use that as an escape hatch when they're faced with difficulty. And that can be a very hard habit to discourage. So when your teenager says, oh no, you have to let them know that this leaves you with no choice but to step in. And that's when tyranny is most likely to emerge, because you don't know what your child wants. After all, they don't know what they want, and they won't engage with you so that you can both find out. In many cases, I don't know really means shut up and go away. And you know what? That's fair enough. But you should clearly point out to your teenager that the consequences of their abdication of the responsibility to think is that other people will think for them. That's what happens in life. Voids get filled. And that will happen to them in relationships too. It's like Alex Hormozy says, thinking is about three things: logic, evidence, and utility. In other words, thinking involves three questions. What does this mean? Logic. How do I know that? Evidence. And why does any of this matter? Utility or usefulness. Hormozy has another good tip. The best way to know who a real friend is to see how they react when you win. And when that happens, you'll realize how few real friends you really have. So only take advice from people whose dreams for your life are bigger than yours are. And you should be that person for your kid. One of the things that is happening these days and making things even more difficult for everyone involved is that teenagers are doing a lot fewer of the things that they did 20 years ago, like spending time with friends, going out on dates, going out by themselves to do things, and even getting their driver's license. It is worthwhile to discuss that situation with your child, especially as regards a driver's license. Let them know what the consequences of not being independent are. It's a lot easier, for example, to go out and look for a job if you can drive. You're likely to get a much better job. It's a lot easier to leave home. It's much easier to travel. It's much easier to be confident in yourself. Laying out the reasons that it's necessary for your teenager to mature and become self-reliant is a reasonable start in the right direction, as is planning with them how those steps might be undertaken. As parents, you have to decide with your spouse if you are even inclined toward having your child take steps towards adulthood. And a good place to start is to doubt that you are. Maybe you're afraid. Maybe you don't want to expose them to the risks. But in that case, you have to realize that the other risk is that they stay overgrown children and become bitter, resentful, and unhappy. And they fail. And that also constitutes a risk. So as a parent, you have to prioritize your fears and get them straight in order to do the right thing. If you're properly oriented in your job as a parent, you should be thrilled when your teenager takes a step towards genuine adult autonomy, regardless of the risk, given the risks of not doing so. And when your teenager does something that's indicative of more mature behavior on their part, you actually need to let them know that you see that and encourage them to keep growing. Parents should be happy about their child's maturation. Many parents might say, "I'm not sure how much my child is capable of doing." The answer to that question is to push the limits and find out. Your child can do more than you think that they can, just like you can do more than you think you can do. To sum up, what are the lessons that you might take away from today's final lesson? Distribute responsibility where you can, because if everybody in the household is pulling their weight in accordance with their abilities, then the household becomes a harmonious place where people can cooperate and compete peacefully and productively, and everyone can get along and the future looks secure and bright. If you really want the improvements and you really communicate with each other about what is happening and you make that a priority in your family, then there is probably no reason why you can't achieve your goals and get what you want in your family. Homework helps to give everyone a practical place to start. So ask your child if he or she would write about one specific problem of communication in your household. Have them include a way that they could determine to take responsibility for solving that problem of communication and for helping to implement the solution in the household. You can do the same thing for your own life. Write about a specific problem in your life that you are failing to make progress on. Then strategize about how you could take responsibility for negotiating with yourself in a more productive way that is likely to get you somewhere. Include ideas about how you can go about ensuring that the incentives stack the deck in your favor. And in the weeks that follow, we will be considering what the future holds for all of us by looking at the effects of raising our daughters on social media, and by looking at what is happening to our sons in the digital age as well. But it won't be all doom and gloom, because we will also be discussing what parents can realistically do about saving their children from the downsides of our modern fate. We will also cover strategies for helping children survive both bullying and peer pressure, and finally, we will be taking an in-depth look at the lost art of resilience. So I hope that you keep coming back. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please help me build this podcast into a success by clicking the like and follow buttons, because that is what does the trick in making these things a success. And I hope you come back again next week. Until then, have a good week, my friends.